On the second morning of March 1883, a picture bride named Sun Yi stepped off the gangplank at a Wyoming rail depot clutching a photograph of a man who had died 4 days before her ship touched land. The rancher's family who met her at the depot held the deed to 1,100 acres, 300 head of cattle, and every name that mattered from Cheyenne to the county line. Everyone expected the girl to be sent back east on the next train, a debt nobody owed and nobody wanted. What the dead man's brother did instead, standing in the mud of that depot in front of the whole town, would be talked about in that county for the rest of the century. His name was Nathaniel Cole, and the county called him the coldest man west of the Platte River, a rancher who had buried 2 brothers and spoken maybe 40 words to another living soul since the second funeral. His younger brother Elias was the one who had sent for a bride from a photograph and a letter written by a translator in Seoul, promising land, a roof, and a name. Nobody in that town believed a foreign girl could hold a homestead alone, and the family had already agreed among themselves, in low voices at the funeral supper, that she would be paid off and put back on the rail line before the spring branding. Nathaniel had signed nothing. The contract, the photograph, the promise, none of it carried his name. He expected to pay her off by Christmas and never think of her again. What happened instead began the moment he saw her standing in the mud, refusing to cry in front of people who wanted her to. The letter had taken 11 weeks to cross the ocean, and Sun Yi had read it so many times aboard the ship that the fold lines had gone soft as cloth. Elias Cole wrote a plain hand, promising a house with a real floor, a stove that drew well, and a husband who would not raise his voice. She had memorized the shape of his handwriting before she ever saw his face in the tintype photograph tucked inside the envelope. A young man with a crooked smile and eyes that looked, she thought, a little afraid of the camera. She had built a whole private life around that face during the crossing, rehearsing the Korean words she would still allow herself to speak only at night, practicing the English phrases the missionary woman in Busan had taught her. "Good morning, thank you, I am glad to meet you." None of the phrases she had practiced accounted for a coffin. She learned of Elias Cole's death from a station master who did not know how to say it gently, because he did not know she understood English well enough to need gentleness. "A fever," he said. "Took him fast, 4 days back, the whole family still in black." He looked at her steamer trunk and her cloth bundle the way a man looks at a debt somebody else incurred. Behind him, across the platform, the Cole family stood in a loose, dark cluster, an older woman with iron in her spine, 2 ranch hands, and a tall man in a long coat who had not said a single word since the train pulled in. Sun Yi set her bundle down in the mud because her arms had begun to shake, and she made herself stand straight, because her mother had told her once that a woman who cries in front of strangers gives them the only thing they came for. The tall man in the long coat finally crossed the platform toward her, and the whole town went quiet to hear what he would say. Nathaniel Cole stopped 3 feet from her and did not offer his hand, because in that county men did not touch a stranger's wife, dead husband or not. Up close she was smaller than the photograph had suggested, her traveling coat too thin for a Wyoming march, her chin held at an angle that made the ranch hands behind him shift their weight. He asked her name in a voice pitched low, the way a man speaks to a spooked horse, and she answered in English clear enough to make his mother's mouth go tight with surprise. "Sun Yi Han," she said, "I am sorry for your family's loss." It was the wrong thing to say, and the only true thing available to her, and Nathaniel watched something flicker behind her composure before she smoothed it away again. His mother, Agatha Cole, stepped forward then, already speaking as though Sun Yi were a parcel to be redirected. "The girl will need passage back," Agatha said. "There's no contract binding anybody here, God rest Elias, and we won't have the county thinking we kept a stranger out of pity." Sun Yi did not flinch, though the word stranger landed exactly where Agatha intended it to land. She had crossed an ocean on the strength of a dead man's promise, and she understood, standing in that mud, that the promise had died with him, and that everyone present considered the matter closed. Nathaniel said nothing for a long moment, long enough that the wind picked up and pulled at the frayed hem of Sun Yi's coat, long enough that 2 townswomen near the depot office began to whisper behind gloved hands. Then he asked the station master, in front of everyone, what the going rate was for a homestead claim filed but not yet proved. The station master blinked and said he didn't rightly know offhand, sir, and Nathaniel said he'd find out by supper. Agatha's face went the color of old paper. She did not understand yet what her surviving son intended, and neither did Sun Yi. who stood very still amid the mud and the cold and the eyes of a town deciding what kind of story this would become, waiting for someone to tell her whether she was about to be sent home or given a fate stranger than the one she had crossed an ocean to claim. By supper, the whole town knew that Nathaniel Cole had asked about a homestead claim, and by nightfall the story had grown 3 different endings depending on who told it at the mercantile counter. Some said he meant to buy her a ticket home and salve his conscience with a land parcel he'd never file. Others said he meant to marry her himself, though nobody could say why a man who had not spoken more than a greeting to a woman in 2 years would suddenly take a stranger as a wife. Soon-Yi heard none of this directly. She sat in the small back room of the boarding house where Agatha had grudgingly arranged a bed for one night, turning her tintype photograph of Elias over and over in her hands, trying to reconcile the crooked, nervous smile in the image with the 4 days of fever and the coffin she had not been permitted to see. She had not loved him, there had been no time, no meeting, nothing but 11 weeks of letters, but she had built a future around the shape of him, and that future had been buried before her ship ever reached port. Now she owed a debt to no one, and was owed nothing by anyone, a condition that should have felt like freedom, and instead felt like standing on ice that had not yet decided whether it would hold her weight. A knock came at the door near 9 o'clock, sharp and businesslike. It was Nathaniel, holding his hat against his chest, his coat still dusted with the day's cold. He said he had spoken to the county recorder. Elias had filed a homestead claim 8 months prior, 160 acres bordering the Cole Ranch to the east, proved up on paper, but empty of any structure beyond a dugout and a stone chimney. The claim would revert to the county if it went unclaimed past May, he said, unless a legal heir stepped forward. Soon-Yi asked, carefully, what that had to do with her. Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment before answering, and when he did, his voice carried none of the coldness the county had assigned to him. He said the letters Elias had sent her constituted, in the eyes of any judge west of the Missouri, an intended marriage contract, and that intended was a word with more weight in frontier law than most men credited it. He was not offering her charity. He was offering her a choice nobody in that town believed a woman like her should be given, and he wanted her answer by morning. She did not sleep that night, not because the boarding house bed was hard, though it was, but because she was doing arithmetic that had no precedent in any life she had imagined for herself. In Busan, a widow with no husband and no family claim to speak of was a woman with no standing at all, passed between relatives like a debt nobody wanted to carry for long. Here, in this cold country of fences and unclaimed dirt, a piece of paper and a dead man's unfinished promise might mean she owned something outright, not through a husband, not through a father, but through the simple fact that Elias Cole had filed his name on 160 acres and then died before he could stand on any of it. She thought of her mother, who had died believing her daughter was crossing an ocean towards safety, and she thought of the missionary woman in Busan who had warned her that American law treated foreign wives as little better than servants in most territories, though Wyoming, she'd added, almost as an afterthought, had lately begun allowing women to hold land and vote in local matters, a fact so strange it had seemed like a rumor rather than a law. Soon-Yi rose before dawn and dressed in the only clean dress she owned, the dark blue one her mother had sewn a Korean collar into despite the American cut of the rest of it, a small, stubborn thread of home stitched into a garment meant for a country that wanted her to disappear into it. When Nathaniel knocked again at first light, she was already standing, already decided, though she made him wait for her answer the way he had made the town wait the day before. She told him she would take the claim, and she would work it herself, and she would not be paid off, married off, or sent off, and if the county objected to a Korean woman holding land in her dead intended's name, then the county could take the matter up with a judge. Nathaniel's expression did not change much, but something in his shoulders eased, as though he had been holding a question closed inside himself, and had just heard the only answer that let him breathe again. He told her the dugout on the claim had no door worth the name, and the roof leaked along the north seam, and she told him she had slept in worse, which was not entirely true, but which she said anyway because she understood already that this man respected nothing so much as a person who did not ask him for softness. Agatha Cole did not attend the filing at the county recorder's office, and she made her absence loud in the way silence can be loud in a small town, refusing to acknowledge Soon-Yi on the street 2 days running, instructing the ranch hands not to lend the foreign girl so much as a shovel. The recorder, a heavy-set man named Whitfield with ink permanently ground into the creases of his knuckles, studied the marriage letters for a long time before looking up at Soon Yi over his spectacles, then at Nathaniel, standing silent beside her, then back at the letters, clearly hunting for a reason to refuse the claim that he could defend to the county judge if Agatha came asking. He found none. Elias Cole's handwriting matched his other filings. The intent was documented in his own words, dated and witnessed by the ship's purser, who had read the letters aloud before Soon Yi's departure, a formality she had insisted on herself, some instinct telling her that a foreign woman's word alone would never be enough in this country. Whitfield stamped the transfer with obvious reluctance and told her, not unkindly, that she would need to prove the claim within the year, build a habitable structure, work the land, show the county she meant to stay, or the acreage would revert regardless of any letter. Soon Yi thanked him in the same clear English that had unsettled Agatha and walked out of that office holding a folded document that named her, for the first time since her mother's death, as something other than a woman waiting to be assigned to someone else's household. Nathaniel walked her partway back toward the boarding house in silence, before stopping at the fork where the road split toward his own ranch and hers. He told her he would send a wagon of lumber and 2 ranch hands by Thursday to patch the dugout roof before it fell in on her. And when she began to protest that she had not asked for his charity, he cut her off, gently for a man with his reputation, and said it wasn't charity, it was a debt his brother owed and never paid, and he intended to see it settled properly. Then he tipped his hat, the first gesture of plain courtesy the county had seen him extend to anyone in 2 years, and walked away without waiting to see whether she accepted the lumber, leaving her standing at the fork in the road with a claim to her name and no earthly idea yet what kind of man had just quietly attached himself to her fate. The dugout squatted into the side of a low rise like something the land had grown rather than something a man had built, its walls sod cut in thick bricks, its single window a square of oiled paper that let in more gray light than clear. Soon Yi stood before it on her first morning as its owner and understood immediately why the county required proof of habitation before granting a claim outright. No reasonable person would call this place a home without evidence that someone intended to make it one. The roof sagged along the north seam exactly as Nathaniel had warned, and inside, the dirt floor had been packed hard by whatever animals had sheltered there in Elias's long absences tending cattle, and a colony of field mice had clearly considered the place abandoned and claimed it for their own. She had grown up in a house with polished wooden floors and a grandmother who swept the courtyard twice daily. And for one long moment, standing in that doorway with her cloth bundle still over her shoulder, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of how far she had traveled from anything resembling comfort. Then she set the bundle down on the one dry corner of floor she could find and began, methodically, the way her mother had taught her to begin any task too large to face all at once, by doing the smallest possible piece of it first. She swept. She found a broken crate and used its boards to prop the sagging roof beam temporarily. She discovered, tucked into a tin box, beneath what had clearly served as Elias's bed, a stack of letters. Her own letters, the ones she had written back to him during their 11-week correspondence, kept and reread so many times the paper had softened at the folds, exactly as her copies of his letters had softened. He had cared, she realized, sitting on the edge of that narrow bed with her own handwriting in her lap. He had built an entire private hope around her the same way she had built one around him, and neither hope had survived contact with a Wyoming fever season. She allowed herself to cry then, finally, alone in a dugout with a leaking roof, for a man she had never met and a version of her own future that had died with him, and she did not stop until the light through the oiled paper window had gone the deep orange of late afternoon, at which point she wiped her face, stood, and went back to sweeping, because grief, she had learned early in life, was a visitor you were allowed to receive but never allowed to let move in permanently. Nathaniel's wagon of lumber arrived Thursday as promised, driven by 2 ranch hands named Purdy and Co., who eyed Soon Yi with the particular caution of men who had been told by their employer to help, but not told why, and who clearly harbored their own theories about the arrangement that they were wise enough not to voice aloud. They unloaded fresh-cut boards and a bundle of shingles, and, at Nathaniel's evident instruction, a small iron stove that Soon Yi recognized with a jolt as considerably finer than anything the dugout deserved. She asked Purdy, the older and more talkative of the two, whether Mr. Cole made a habit of sending stoves to strangers, and Purdy, pausing mid-lift, said that Mr. Cole hadn't sent anybody so much as a kind word to a living soul since his brother Caleb died of a rattlesnake bite 3 years back, and that whatever was happening here was the first thing resembling human feeling anybody at the Cole Ranch had witnessed out of him since. Sun Yi filed this information away carefully, the way she filed away every scrap of understanding about this country and its people, because she had learned that survival here depended on reading what people did not say aloud nearly as much as what they did. Nathaniel himself arrived toward evening, after the roof had been patched and the stove installed, dismounting at a respectful distance from the dugout and waiting to be invited closer rather than assuming welcome. She invited him in to see the repairs, and he stood in the doorway rather than crossing the threshold, his hat once again pressed to his chest, surveying the patched roof with the critical eye of a man who built things for a living and did not accept sloppy work even from his own hired hands. He told her the roof would hold through spring rains, but she'd want a proper shingle job before next winter, and she said she intended to be here next winter to see to it herself, a statement that made something shift again in his expression, the same easing she had noticed at the recorder's office. He asked, almost as an afterthought, whether she had eaten, and when she admitted she had been too occupied with the roof to think of supper, he produced, from his saddlebag, a wrapped parcel of bread and dried beef that his mother's cook had prepared for the ranch hands, and that he had, apparently, simply not given to them. It was not much. It was, Sun Yi understood as she accepted it, the first gift given to her in this country by someone asking nothing in return, and she ate it slowly that night by the light of her new stove, turning the small kindness over in her mind the way she had turned over Elias's letters, trying to understand what kind of debt, exactly, a man paid off by giving away his own supper. The county did not receive the arrangement with anything like grace. Word spread quickly that the foreign bride had been given a filed claim and, more scandalously, that Nathaniel Cole had personally delivered lumber and a stove to a woman with no legal tie to him beyond a dead brother's unconsummated intentions. At the mercantile, women who had never spoken a word to Sun Yi found reasons to discuss her within her hearing, remarking on the strangeness of her dress, the oddness of her accent, the impropriety of an unmarried woman accepting gifts from a man who was, whatever the letters said, not her husband. Sun Yi bought her flour and her needles and said nothing, because she had learned in Busan that arguing with a room that had already decided its opinion only fed the opinion more fuel. But the pressure found its way to Nathaniel too, delivered by his mother in the particular weaponized concern Agatha specialized in. Agatha arrived at his ranch house on a Sunday evening and informed him, without preamble, that the whole county believed he intended to marry the girl himself, and that such a match would embarrass the Cole name beyond repair, given everything the family had built in that valley across 3 generations. Nathaniel, who rarely raised his voice, informed his mother in a tone she had not heard from him since Caleb's funeral that the Cole name had built exactly nothing that mattered to him since the day they lowered his second brother into the ground, and that if the county wished to gossip about a widow rebuilding a roof, the county could occupy itself with something more productive. Agatha left angrier than she had arrived, and Nathaniel spent that night on his porch in the cold, staring toward the low rise where Sun Yi's dugout sat with its single-lit window, turning over a feeling he had not permitted himself in 3 years and did not entirely trust himself to name. He had told himself the lumber and the stove were debts owed to Elias, obligations of blood rather than affection. But he found himself, that night, thinking not of his dead brother's unfinished promise, but of the particular way Sun Yi had said she intended to be here next winter, as though the words were a vow spoken to the land itself rather than to him, and he recognized, with the discomfort of a man unused to recognizing his own feelings, that he wanted very much to see whether she would keep it. Spring arrived in Wyoming the way it arrived everywhere on that stretch of plain, not gently but suddenly, mud giving way to green in a matter of days once the thaw truly committed itself. And Sun Yi spent that transition learning to farm ground she had never expected to own in a climate that operated by rules no one in Busan could have taught her. She made mistakes that would have been comic if they had not each cost her time and seed she could barely afford to lose, planting too early against a killing frost, misjudging how far apart to space her rows, trusting a neighbor's advice about a creek crossing that left her cart wheel-deep in mud for the better part of an afternoon. But she also discovered in herself a stubbornness that surprised even her, a refusal to be defeated by dirt that seemed to compound with every setback rather than diminish. Nathaniel began appearing at the claim with a frequency that both of them declined to examine too closely, always with a stated reason. Checking a fence line that happened to run near her property, delivering seed his own operation had in surplus, once simply riding past on his way elsewhere, and stopping because her mule had gotten itself tangled in harness, and she was too proud to call for help, but visibly relieved when it arrived anyway. Their conversations remained sparse, weighted more towards silence than speech, but Sun Yi noticed that his silences around her had a different quality than the silences the rest of the county described, less a wall and more a kind of listening. She began, without entirely deciding to, telling him small things about Korea during these visits, the sound of rain on tiled roofs, the particular ache of her grandmother's hands from decades of needlework, the reason she kept a single ribbon from a hanbok her mother had sewn tucked into the lining of her travel coat, a scrap of home she touched sometimes without noticing she had done it. Nathaniel listened to these fragments the way he seemed to listen to everything, with his full and undivided attention, offering little of himself in return except, once, on a cold evening while they worked together to right a fence post, the wind had knocked loose, the admission that Caleb's death had been the kind that made a man wonder whether love was simply grief that hadn't happened yet. Sun Yi did not answer that immediately. She only worked the post deeper into the ground beside him and let the silence between them hold the weight of a question neither of them was ready to ask aloud. It was Purdy in the end who let slip the detail that reshaped everything Sun Yi thought she understood about the Cole family, and he did it without meaning to, over coffee at the mercantile while she waited for her flour to be weighed. He mentioned in passing that it was a mercy Elias's fever had taken him quicker than Caleb's rattlesnake bite 3 years prior, which had taken 11 days and had been, in Purdy's blunt phrase, the worst 11 days he'd ever watched a family live through, worse even for Nathaniel than for their mother. On account of Nathaniel being the one who'd been out riding with Caleb when the snake struck and who'd carried his brother's body the 4 miles back alone because there'd been no one else close enough to help, Sun Yi had known, in the vague way the whole county knew, that Nathaniel had lost 2 brothers. She had not known he had watched the second one die slowly over 11 days with his own hands, or that he had carried the body himself, or that the cold reputation the county had assigned him dated not from some inherent hardness, but from a specific 11-day period during which something in him had simply stopped extending itself toward other people, as though closing a door were the only way to survive standing in the room where it happened. She thought of every silence she had attributed to coldness, every clipped sentence she had privately catalogued as evidence of a hard man, and felt something in her own understanding shift and resettle, the way ground resettles after a hard rain. That evening, when Nathaniel arrived at her claim with a sack of seed potatoes he claimed his own cellar had no room for, she asked him directly, in the plain way she had learned served her better in this country than indirection, whether it was true that he had carried Caleb home himself. Nathaniel went very still, the seed sack still balanced on one shoulder, and for a moment she thought she had overstepped in a way that would cost her the fragile trust they had built across a winter of small kindnesses. Then he set the sack down slowly and told her, in a voice stripped of its usual careful control, that he had carried his brother 4 miles across broken ground, while Caleb begged him, delirious with fever and venom, not to let him die alone in the dirt, and that Nathaniel had promised him he wouldn't, and had kept that promise right up until the moment it no longer mattered, because Caleb had died in his arms less than a mile from the house, close enough to see the lamp in the window. He had not told this to anyone in 3 years, not his mother, not the county doctor who'd signed the death certificate, and Sun Yi understood, standing in the deepening dusk with the seed potatoes forgotten between them, that he had just handed her something far heavier than a stove or a roof repair, and that whatever came next between them would be built on the foundation of that particular kind of trust, the kind that cannot be taken back once given. The county held its Founders' Day gathering in early June, an event that drew every ranching family for 30 miles into the town square for a shared meal, a series of speeches from men who had founded very little of actual consequence, and the kind of collective scrutiny that Sun Yi had learned to brace herself against every time she appeared anywhere in public. Agatha Cole had made it known, through the efficient channels of small-town gossip, that she considered Sun Yi's attendance an imposition on a family event, despite Sun Yi holding land that bordered the Cole ranch and having been, however briefly, the intended wife of a Cole son. Sun Yi attended anyway, in the dark blue dress with the Korean collar, because she had decided months earlier that avoiding rooms where she was unwelcome would only teach the county that her absence could be purchased with enough cold looks, and she refused to be that easily bought. The gathering proceeded predictably for the first hour, Sun Yi standing at its edges with a plate she barely touched, while conversations paused and resumed around her presence like water moving around a stone. Then a rancher named Pruitt, a large man with a large voice and a long-standing rivalry with the Cole family over water rights, made a joke at Sun Yi's expense loud enough to carry across the square, something about foreign women and the price of a homestead claim, crude enough that even his own wife looked away in embarrassment. The square went quiet in the particular way a crowd goes quiet when it senses something is about to happen and does not yet know what. Nathaniel, who had been standing near the horse pickets speaking with the county recorder Whitfield, crossed the square in a handful of long strides and stopped directly in front of Pruitt, close enough that the larger man took an involuntary step back. He did not raise his voice. He said, in a tone the whole square could hear regardless, that Sun Yi Han held a legal claim to Cole land through his brother's own signed word, that she had proved that claim through a winter and spring of harder work than most men in that square had done in a year, and that the next person who made a joke at her expense in his hearing would find out exactly how a Cole settled a grievance that mattered to him. Pruitt, to his credit, had the sense to apologize, mumbled and insincere as it was, and the square's attention swiveled entirely towards Sun Yi, who stood very still, absorbing the fact that a man reputed to feel nothing had just defended her honor in front of the same people who had watched her humiliated on a rail platform 3 months earlier, and that something in the balance of the county's opinion had just shifted, however slightly, in her favor. The ride back from Founders Day passed in a silence that felt different from their usual comfortable quiet, charged instead with the unspoken weight of what Nathaniel had done in front of the entire county. Sun Yi finally broke it herself, asking him plainly why he had defended her so publicly, when a quieter word to Pruitt afterward would have accomplished the same correction without making a spectacle of either of them. Nathaniel considered the question for the length of a fence line before answering, and when he did, his voice carried an honesty that surprised her more than the defense itself had. He said that quiet corrections were what he had offered the world for 3 years, ever since Caleb died, small, invisible efforts to keep his own grief from touching anyone else, and that watching Pruitt humiliate her in front of the whole square had made him understand, suddenly and without warning, that he was tired of being quiet about the things that mattered to him. He said her name then, deliberately, Sun Yi, pronouncing it with more care than most of the county bothered to attempt, and told her that somewhere across the winter he had stopped thinking of her as his dead brother's unfinished business and started thinking of her as someone whose good opinion he wanted to earn on his own account, a realization that had unsettled him considerably, given how carefully he had avoided wanting anything from anyone since Caleb's death. Sun Yi did not answer immediately, guiding her mule along the rutted road while she turned his words over with the same careful attention she gave everything in this unfamiliar country. She told him finally that she had crossed an ocean to marry a man she had never met, based on nothing but 11 weeks of letters and a photograph, and that she had grieved him sincerely despite that thinness of acquaintance, and that she did not know what it meant, that the grief had, somewhere in the months since, become tangled up with a different feeling entirely, one she associated now with lamplight and seed potatoes and a man who had told her the worst thing that had ever happened to him, standing in the dusk with nothing to gain from the telling. Nathaniel stopped his horse. She stopped her mule beside him. Neither of them said anything further for a long moment, the county road empty in both directions, the wheat fields gone gold in the late afternoon light, and the question that had been building between them for months hung there unasked, because both of them understood that whatever they said next would change the shape of everything that came after it. Agatha Cole did not accept defeat easily, and the weeks following Founders Day saw her escalate from disapproving silence to active interference, beginning with a visit to the county judge to inquire, with feigned innocence, whether a claim granted on the strength of an unmarried woman's correspondence with a since-deceased man could be legally contested by surviving family. The judge, a pragmatic man named Ellery, who had no patience for family squabbles dressed up as legal questions, informed Agatha that the claim had been properly filed, witnessed, and proved according to every relevant statute, and that pursuing the matter further would cost the Cole family considerably more in legal fees than the acreage was worth. Undeterred, Agatha turned her efforts toward Nathaniel directly, arriving at his ranch house with an ultimatum dressed as motherly concern, that if he intended to court the girl, as the whole county now openly suspected, He would do so without the Cole name attached to any wedding, and without a single acre of Cole land settled on her as dowry, because Agatha would not see 3 generations of careful accumulation diluted by a match she considered beneath the family's standing. Nathaniel listened to the entirety of this speech without interrupting, and then told his mother, with a calm that unsettled her more than anger would have, that he had built his own herd and his own reputation separately from anything she controlled, that he intended to court Sun Yi Han openly and without apology, and that if Agatha could not find her way to civility toward a woman who had proved a homestead claim alone through a Wyoming winter while grieving a man she barely knew, then Agatha was welcome to absent herself from whatever came next, exactly as she had absented herself from the filing at the recorder's office. Agatha left his ranch house that afternoon in a fury that would take weeks to cool, and word of the confrontation reached Sun Yi within a day, delivered with visible satisfaction by Purdy, who had clearly taken sides in a conflict that was not technically his to take sides in. Sun Yi received the news with a complicated mixture of gratitude and worry. Gratitude that Nathaniel had chosen her openly against his own mother's wishes. Worry that she had become the wedge splitting a family that had already lost 2 sons and could ill afford to lose a mother's goodwill as well. She resolved, that evening, that whatever happened between herself and Nathaniel, she would not be the reason a grieving family broke permanently, and she began, quietly and without telling him, to consider what gesture might begin to thaw Agatha's opposition rather than simply outlasting it. The gesture Sun Yi eventually settled on took shape slowly across several weeks, born from a memory she had carried since childhood of her grandmother mending quarrels between neighbors, not through argument, but through the quiet diplomacy of shared work. She learned, through careful and patient questioning of Purdy and Co., that Agatha had once kept a garden behind the original Cole ranch house, elaborate and much admired, before Caleb's death had drained her interest in anything requiring tenderness, and that the garden had gone to weeds and neglect in the 3 years since. Sun Yi began, without announcing her intentions to anyone, walking the 1.5 miles to the Cole ranch on mornings when her own chores allowed it, and working the abandoned garden bed by bed, while Agatha was occupied elsewhere on the property, clearing weeds, turning soil, salvaging what perennials had survived the neglect. She left no note explaining the work, offered no confrontation, simply appeared and labored and left before Agatha returned from her rounds, repeating the pattern 3 mornings a week for nearly a month. Agatha noticed, of course, and initially assumed one of the ranch hands responsible, until Purdy, unable to resist the drama of the situation, informed her precisely who had been restoring her garden and why. Agatha's reaction, when she finally confronted Sun Yi directly in the garden itself on a warm morning in July, was not the gratitude Sun Yi might have hoped for, but a kind of wounded confusion, an accusation that Sun Yi was attempting to purchase her approval through manipulation rather than honest feeling. Sun Yi, kneeling in the dirt with soil under her fingernails, answered with a directness that seemed to genuinely surprise the older woman, saying that she had not done the work to purchase anything, but because she understood what it meant to lose the people who gave your life its shape, and because a garden left to weeds seemed to her a small, unnecessary grief, added onto a larger one that could not be helped. She told Agatha then about her own mother's death, about the ribbon from a hanbok she still kept in her coat lining, about the particular ache of carrying a home inside yourself while standing in ground that did not yet feel like it belonged to you. Agatha listened in silence, and when Sun Yi finished speaking, the older woman knelt, with visible difficulty and against every instinct of her own dignity, and began pulling weeds beside her, the 2 women working the ruined garden together without further words, while 3 years of grief that Agatha had never permitted herself to properly grieve began, almost imperceptibly, to loosen its grip. The thaw between Sun Yi and Agatha did not announce itself with any dramatic reconciliation, but arrived instead in small increments over the following weeks, Agatha appearing at Sun Yi's claim with cuttings from the restored garden, Sun Yi teaching Agatha a Korean stitch pattern for mending that the older woman found unexpectedly useful for her arthritic hands, the 2 women developing a working rapport that neither Nathaniel nor the county had anticipated. It was during one of these visits that Agatha, working a needle through fabric on Sun Yi's small porch, finally raised the subject everyone in the county had been discussing for months and that Nathaniel himself had not yet formally raised with Sun Yi. She asked, without preamble, whether Sun Yi intended to marry her surviving son, and whether Sun Yi understood that such a marriage would mean stepping fully into a family that had buried 2 sons and had, until recently, buried most of its capacity for warmth along with them. Sun Yi set down her own needlework and considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, telling Agatha honestly that she had not been asked yet, that Nathaniel had shown her every kindness a man could show a woman without formally declaring his intentions, and that she suspected he was waiting for some signal from his mother before allowing himself to want something openly again. Agatha absorbed this with a long silence, then admitted, in a voice roughened by more emotion than she typically permitted herself, that she had spent 3 years so afraid of losing another person she loved that she had preemptively pushed away anyone who might have filled the space her sons had left, and that watching Nathaniel choose Sun Yi so deliberately, so publicly, had terrified her precisely because it meant he had started hoping again, and hope, in Agatha's hard-won experience, was the thing that got taken from you hardest when it was finally taken. Sun Yi reached across the small distance between their chairs and took the older woman's roughened hand in her own, an act of tenderness that surprised them both, and told her that she understood the fear better than Agatha perhaps realized, having crossed an ocean toward a hope that had died before her ship ever docked, and having chosen, every day since, to keep hoping anyway, because the alternative was a kind of living death she refused to accept. Agatha did not respond in words. She simply held Sun Yi's hand for a long moment, and when Nathaniel arrived at the claim an hour later to find his mother and the woman he loved sitting together on the porch in comfortable silence, he stopped his horse at the fence line and watched them for several minutes before approaching, understanding, without being told, that something significant had shifted in his absence. Nathaniel proposed to Sun Yi on an ordinary Tuesday in August, with no audience and no elaborate staging, because he had learned across their year of careful courtship that she valued honesty over spectacle in every matter that counted. He found her in her own small field, sleeves rolled against the heat, checking the corn she had planted against every piece of advice the county had given her about what would and would not grow on that particular rise of ground, and which had, against expectation, grown taller and greener than anyone had predicted. He walked out into the rows to stand beside her, rather than calling her in from her work, and told her, without preamble or rehearsed speech, that he had spent a year watching her prove every doubt the county held about her wrong, that he had watched his own mother's grief soften in her presence when nothing else had touched it in 3 years, and that he did not want to spend one more season pretending the feeling between them was anything other than what it plainly was. He asked her to marry him not as a settlement of his brother's unfinished debt, but as a choice made entirely on his own account, and he told her that he understood if she needed time, given everything the past year had cost her, but that he had waited long enough to say the words honestly, that he did not intend to wait any longer to ask. Sun Yi stood among her own corn, in ground she had claimed and proved and defended through a winter that had tried its best to defeat her, and found that the answer required no deliberation at all, because she had already, somewhere across the months of seed potatoes and mended fences and a shared garden, stopped calculating whether this country would ever feel like home and started simply living as though it already did. She said yes in English, clear and certain, and then, because the moment seemed to call for something older and more private, she said it again in Korean, a language she had not spoken aloud to another living person since her mother's death, and Nathaniel, who understood none of the words but every ounce of the feeling behind them, pulled her into an embrace among the tall green corn that neither of them would forget for the rest of their lives. Word of the engagement reached the county by the following morning, and this time, remarkably, the gossip that spread carried less scandal than something closer to grudging admiration, as though the whole valley had been waiting, without quite admitting it, to see whether the coldest man west of the Platte River would finally let himself be warmed. The wedding took place in late September, timed deliberately before the first hard frost, in the restored garden behind the Cole ranch house that Agatha had insisted upon the moment she learned of the engagement, declaring that the garden Sun Yi had brought back to life was the only fitting place for the ceremony. The county turned out in numbers that surprised everyone, including Pruitt, whose wife had quietly informed him he would attend and behave himself or sleep in the barn through the coming winter, and even Whitfield, the recorder, who told anyone who would listen that he had personally witnessed every stage of Sun Yi's claim and considered himself entitled to see how the story concluded. Sun Yi wore a dress that married both worlds she now belonged to, American in its cut and construction but trimmed with the ribbon from her mother's hanbok, worked carefully into the collar by Agatha's own needle over the preceding weeks, a gesture that had moved Sun Yi to tears when Agatha first showed her the finished garment. Nathaniel stood waiting in the garden in a dark suit that Purdy later swore was the first article of formal clothing anyone had seen him wear since Caleb's funeral, and when Sun Yi walked toward him along the path she had cleared of weeds with her own hands months earlier, the entire gathered county fell into a silence very different from the hostile silence that had greeted her arrival at the rail depot 19 months before. The ceremony itself was brief, conducted by a circuit preacher who had ridden 2 days to perform it, but the moment that lingered longest in the county's collective memory came afterward, when Agatha rose to speak a few words, something no one had expected of a woman who had spent 3 years avoiding public sentiment of any kind. She spoke of her son Elias, whose kindness had first reached across an ocean, and of her son Caleb, whose death had nearly closed her family's heart permanently, and she said that she believed both her lost sons would recognize, in the woman standing before them, the very qualities that had made this family worth building in the first place: patience, stubborn hope, and a refusal to let hardship have the final word. She looked directly at Sun Yi as she said this, and the two women held each other's gaze across the garden with an understanding that needed no further translation, while behind them, the wheat fields that bordered the property caught the last gold light of the afternoon and turned the entire valley the color of a promise finally kept. 3 winters passed after the wedding, and the county that had once watched Sun Yi Cole step off a train as an unwanted burden came, gradually and then completely, to regard her as one of its most respected residents, a transformation that owed nothing to charity and everything to the plain accumulated evidence of a homestead proved, a marriage sustained, and a community quietly served. She had expanded her original claim's modest corn planting into a small but thriving operation that supplied vegetables to half the county through the growing season, and she had done so while raising 2 children with Nathaniel, a boy named for Caleb, and a girl given a Korean name, Hyun, meaning grace, that Sun Yi insisted upon, over the mild objections of a county still adjusting to unfamiliar syllables. Agatha had moved by the second winter from grudging acceptance to open devotion, spending more time at Sun Yi's kitchen table than her own, teaching her granddaughter English lullabies while Sun Yi taught her son Korean ones, the 2 languages braiding together in that small farmhouse in a way that had once seemed impossible to imagine on a muddy rail platform. Pruitt, of all people, had become an unlikely ally, having discovered that Sun Yi's advice on crop rotation saved his own struggling acreage from a second consecutive bad season, and he had taken to defending her reputation in the mercantile with the fervor of a man overcorrecting for an old public shame. The rail depot itself, the site of Sun Yi's original humiliation, had become something of a local landmark in an unofficial way, townspeople occasionally pointing it out to newcomers as the place where the widow Han had arrived with nothing, and built, through sheer refusal to be diminished, one of the most respected homesteads in the valley. Nathaniel, for his part, had become known throughout the county, not for coldness, but for a particular quiet steadiness that people had come to rely upon, serving 2 terms on the county water board, and mediating disputes with a fairness that traced, he would admit to no one but Sun Yi, directly back to the year he had watched his own capacity for justice reawaken in her defense. On the anniversary of her arrival each March, Sun Yi walked alone to the rail depot, a private ritual she had never fully explained even to Nathaniel, standing on the same platform where she had once set down her bundle in the mud and refused to cry, and allowing herself, in that quiet annual reckoning, to feel the full distance between the woman who had stood there friendless and the woman who now walked home afterward to a house full of people who loved her. It was during the 4th spring after her wedding that Sun Yi finally told Nathaniel the full story of Elias's letters, a conversation she had postponed, not out of secrecy, but out of a sense that some griefs needed years rather than months to become speakable without reopening entirely. She showed him, for the first time, the tin box of correspondence she had kept since that first day in the dugout, her own letters returned to her alongside his brother's, and she read aloud several passages that revealed a side of Elias neither of them had fully appreciated: his nervousness about whether an educated woman like Sun Yi would find frontier life beneath her, his private hope that his family would come to love her as much as he anticipated he would, his plans, never realized, to build her a proper house with a wooden floor before winter set in. Nathaniel listened to his brother's voice rendered in careful, hopeful handwriting, and found himself grieving Elias freshly, not for the brother he had known, but for the version of him revealed in these letters, a young man who had reached across an ocean in good faith and never lived to see what his reaching had ultimately built. He told Sun Yi that evening, that he believed Elias would be glad, in whatever way the dead were capable of gladness, to know that his intended bride had found not the modest life he had promised her, but something larger, a family restored, a valley's respect earned, a homestead thriving where he had left only a dugout and an unfinished hope. Sun-Yi agreed, and added something she had never said aloud before, that she sometimes thought of her life as two houses built on the same foundation, one that Elias had begun and never got to finish, and one that Nathaniel had built up from the wreckage of that unfinished start, and that she did not feel she had betrayed the first house by living so fully in the second, but rather that she had honored it by making sure the foundation had not gone to waste. They sat together with the old letters between them until the lamp burned low, two people bound not only by love but by a shared reverence for the dead man whose kindness had, however briefly and painfully, made their meeting possible at all, and when they finally closed the tin box and set it away, it was with the understanding that they would open it again someday for their children, so that Caleb and Hayan would grow up knowing the full, complicated, ultimately redemptive shape of how their family had come to be. The county held its Founders' Day gathering again that June, 5 years to the season after the day Pruitt had humiliated Sun-Yi in the town square, and Nathaniel had crossed that same square to defend her in front of everyone. This year, the gathering organizers, without any prompting from the Cole family, asked Sun-Yi to say a few words to open the event, an honor typically reserved for the county's oldest and most established families, and one that would have seemed unthinkable in the year of her arrival. She stood before the same crowd that had once watched her stand alone and friendless at a rail depot, her daughter Hayan on her hip and her son Caleb holding Nathaniel's hand beside her, and she spoke simply about what she had learned in her years working that valley's stubborn ground. That land did not care where a person came from, only whether they were willing to work it honestly and stay through the hard seasons as well as the easy ones, and that the same, she had come to believe, was true of the people who lived on that land as well. She did not mention the rail platform directly, did not need to, because half the crowd remembered it themselves and the other half had heard the story enough times that it had become a kind of local legend, the tale of the widow Han who arrived, owed nothing, and given nothing, and had built, through sheer refusal to be diminished, a life that the whole county now pointed to with something like pride. Agatha stood near the front of the crowd, openly weeping in a way she would have found mortifying 5 years earlier, and Pruitt, standing beside his wife, called out that the Cole Ranch made the finest neighbors in the whole territory, a public reversal so complete that several older townspeople exchanged amused glances at how thoroughly the valley's opinion had turned. When Sun-Yi finished speaking, Nathaniel crossed the small distance between them, exactly as he had crossed the square 5 years before, but this time not to defend her from an insult, only to stand beside her and take her hand in front of the same community that had once seen her as a burden to be quietly returned, and the two of them stood together in the June sunlight, while their children laughed nearby, a tableau of exactly the vindication that no one that first muddy morning at the depot could ever have predicted. Years later, when Ha-Yun was old enough to ask her mother why she kept a single faded ribbon in a small wooden box on her dresser, rather than displaying it or putting it away entirely, Sun-Yi would take the ribbon out and let her daughter hold it, explaining that it had traveled across an ocean sewn into the lining of a coat, worn by a frightened young woman who had not known whether the country she was sailing toward would ever feel like home. She would tell Hayan about the rail platform, about the mud and the cold and the family that had wanted to send her back on the next train, and about the man who had chosen, in front of the entire county, to give her a chance nobody believed she deserved or needed, not out of obligation, but because somewhere in the watching, he had recognized something in her worth protecting. She would tell her about Elias, whose kindness had started it all and who never lived to see any of what his reaching had built, and about Agatha, whose grief had nearly closed a family's heart forever, before a shared garden had begun to open it again. She would tell her that the valley outside their window, the wheat fields gone gold every autumn and the frozen white plains every winter, had once looked to her like the loneliest place on earth, and had become, through nothing more dramatic than years of ordinary work and unexpected kindness, the only place she had ever truly belonged. Nathaniel, listening from the doorway as he often did during these tellings, would sometimes add his own memory of that first morning at the depot, the particular way she had refused to cry in front of people who wanted her diminished, and how he had known, watching her, that whatever debt his family owed her, he intended to spend the rest of his life repaying it, not as an obligation but as a privilege. Hayan would ask, every time, whether her mother had been afraid, standing alone on that platform with nothing but a photograph of a dead man and a bundle of cloth, and Sun Yi would answer honestly that she had been terrified, and that the terror had not mattered in the end, because she had decided, standing in that mud, that she would rather build a life from nothing in a strange country than return to a home that no longer had room for her, and that the deciding, more than anything the county or the Coles had ever given her, was the thing she was proudest of. Outside their window, the wheat moved in the evening wind exactly as it had the day Nathaniel proposed among the corn, gold, and endless and entirely, finally, hers.